We'll start the Mishnah on Daf Sadi Hey. This Mishnah addresses the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni, which is codified in Parshas Ba'aloscha. And as we'll soon see, in Parshas Ba'aloscha, the Torah outlines three mitzvahs. One is a mitzvah saseh, and the other two are mitzvahs lo saseh, with regard to the Pesach Sheni. And the question is, to what extent do we equate Pesach Rishon with Pesach Sheni? Is it limited only to those three mitzvahs that are explicitly mentioned in the Torah? So the Mishnah says, Ma bein Pesach HaRishon l'Sheni. The following distinctions should be noted between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Rishon asur b'bal yirah ba'imotze. In the case of Pesach Rishon, if a person owns chametz at the time of the Shchitas HaPesach, and the chametz is in his reshus, he violates a lav. Hasheni chametz umatzi mo bebayis. In terms of Pesach Sheni, the law is they can have both chametz and matzah in his house, in his possession, at the time of the Pesach. So that's contrast number one. Contrast number two, Harishon ton halal bachiloso, Hasheni ein ton halal bachiloso. The Pesach Rishon requires Hallel, a song that's sung at the time of the Achilas HaPesach, but that doesn't apply to Pesach Sheni. However, Zeh v'zeh, here are the three common halachas, or four common halachas between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Number one, to unim kriyas hahal be'asiyosan. At the time that they shechted both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, they recited Hallel. The Gemara is going to derive this all from Psukim. Number two, necholim tzli. The mitzvah of both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni requires that the meat of the lamb be roasted. And we'll have to see how to derive this because tzli is not explicit in the pasuk in Ba'aloscha with regard to Pesach Sheni. Third commonality is al matzah umerorin. We eat the korban Pesach, even the second Pesach, together with matzah and mor. And fourthly, dochim es haShabbos. The avoda on the 14th of Iyar, like that of the 14th of Nisan, overrides the Shabbos. Now, before we start the brisa, let's just read the parsha a little bit in Pesach Sheni. We'll open up a chumash, Bamidbar Perek Tes, Sukim Yud Ad Yud Beis, Ish ki yeh tamei lenefesh al b'derech rechoka, lachem al dorosechem v'yosa Pesach Hashem, b'chodesh hasheni b'arba'asar yom ben arbaim yasu oso, al matzos umerorim yochluhu, lo yashiru mimenu ad boker, v'etzem lo yishbu bo, kechol chukas haPesach yasu oso. So we'll notice here that there are three mitzvahs that are explicitly mentioned in the Torah. And those are, number one, al matzos umrom yochlu, that's a positive mitzvah. Number two, lo yashiru menu ad boker, which means the Isur of nosar, when you leave over the meat of the korban until the next morning. That's a lo saseh, but it's a lav hanitak li eseh, because the Torah commands us to burn that nosar. And finally, etzem lo yishbru bo, which is a pure lat lo taseh. And then afterwards, the Torah goes ahead and gives us a general rule, which we call a klal, and it says kechol chukas haPesach yasu oso. So obviously, by giving us the klal, the Torah is expanding the scope of the equation between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. On the other hand, the Torah has a prat, in fact, three pratim, the essay and the two losa says, implying that nothing else should be found to be common between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Torah Rabbanu, we learned in the brisa. Kechol chukas haPesach yasu oso. And the Gemara now is going to be medayik and emphasize the word oso. And it limits the analogy, the equation between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni to oso. And that is, what's the oso? The mitzvah shebegufo hakosuv midaber. The Torah equates Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni only with regard to those mitzvot that apply to the gufo shel carbon, to the way we do the avoda in the carbon, or the way we eat the carbon. For example, the Seder Avoda, identical. The Achila B'tzli, identical. But the Torah doesn't equate it completely. And in terms of mitzvahs that aren't begufo shel carbon, like for example, it's a mitzvah in Pesach Rishon to destroy CR, so that you don't have possession of a chametz. That mitzvah doesn't apply to Pesach Sheni. Then the Brisa goes ahead and creates a middle category between what we call mitzvah she'eno begufo and mitzvah shebegufo. In the middle is called a mitzvah she'al gufo. For example, the mitzvah of eating matzah umarar together with the carbon, that's not a mitzvah in the gufo shel carbon, but it does, in an expanded way, expand the scope of the mitzvah chila in the carbon itself. So there is a relation between the matzah and the mar that you eat together with the carbon pesach, the gufo shel carbon. And on this, the Brisa says, Minoan. How do we know that this category of al gufo is included in the equation between Pesach Rishon, Pesach Sheni, and Tabalon? Because it says in the Pascal, Matzah Sumram Yochlu. So any mitzvah that's similar to Matzah Morar, it's outside the Gufa carbon, but yet it's on the carbon, so it relates to the Gufa Shel carbon. That middle category is included in the analogy, and we extend those mitzvahs to incorporate even Pesach Sheni. Yochel Abraisa says, I might think afilu mitzvah shelo al gufo. Maybe once the Torah has expanded Pesach Sheni to include even a mitzvah al gufo, let's go one step further and let's expand the scope of Pesach Sheni to include even a mitzvah that's not related to the guf at all. For example, destroying chametz. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, "V'etzem lo yishberu bo." The Torah is now restricting and limiting the scope of the equation between Pesach Sheni and Pesach Rishon to the case of Isur Shviras Etzem. And we're going to derive the following conclusion: Mat Shviras Etzem Mitzvah Shebegufo. The lotase of not breaking a bone of the Pesach is in the Gufa Korban is af kol Mitzvah Shebegufo. Any mitzvah that's in the Gufa Korban or al Gufo that we derive from al matzah sumram yochlu, but not something that's completely extraneous to the gufo shel carbon, has no relation to the gufo shel carbon. For example, CR, getting rid of chametz. The Brisa now quotes another opinion. Isi ben Yehuda, he doesn't have this derivation, but rather, Omer, he says, you don't have to derive the exclusion of mitzvos that are external to the gufa carbon, like CR, from etzem lo yishberu bo. Forget about that. Yasu oso. The Torah says with regard to Pesach Sheni, it says Yasu oso, right? Ben Arbaim Yasu oso. Now notice, oso in singular is referring to the carbon Pesach, but Yasu is in plural. And Yasu oso, but mitzvah shebegufa kosu daber. In other words, Isi ben Yehuda wants to derive this conclusion from the fact that it says Yasu oso, and oso relates to the gufo shel carbon. And that's going to exclude, like, for example, the mitzvah of hashbas hasiyar, because that's not Yasu oso. It doesn't relate to the carbon pesach begufo. And later on, the Gemara is going to ask, what does Isi ben Yehuda do with the Alfusa of the Rabbanan and vice versa? Omar Mar, we saw in the Brisa, we're going back to the ratio of the Brisa. Yochel af mitzvah shelo al gufo. I might have come to the conclusion that even a mitzvah that doesn't even have that middle of the road relationship, it's not even like matzah umram yochlu, it's not related to the guf at all. Like, for example, hashbasa siyar ha'amrit, but we're going to derive it mitzvah shebegufa kosev midaber from the fact that the Torah speaks about the requirement of al matzim rom yochluhu, for example, or the iser of leaving the carbon past its allotted time. All those are begufo. And that would include tzli, for example, which is begufo, but it would certainly exclude the mitzvah of destroying chametz. So the Gemara says the following. What's going on here in this brisa? On the one hand, the brisa raises a havamina that the extension of the equation to Pesach Sheni could include even a mitzvah shelo al gufo. And yet, the brisa already before that had derived from the word oso that the Torah is only equating Sheni with Rishon as far as mitzvah shebegufo. So the sequence of this brisa is a little bit odd because it opens with the statement "Kachol chukas yasu oso," and it means that the Torah with the word "oso" is teaching me b'mitzvos gufo hakos. And then the brisa continues and says that I might think that even in the case of mitzvah, which is not the gufo, but you just arrived from oso, you're working backwards, right? When you said yochol afilu mitzvah shelo begufo, what do you mean shelo begufo? You just finished saying that oso means begufo. So where answers hochi kamer, here's how we have to explain this brisa. Hashda the amrit, now that you've said in the brisa that even a mitzvah she'al gufo, which is not begufo mamish, applies to Pesach Sheni. And we derive this from the pasuk al matzim rom yochluhu alma yasu oso lav dafkahu. We've already expanded beyond the oso of mitzvah shebegufo because the case of al matzim rom yochluhu is not a mitzvah shebegufo mamish. So we have to assume that oso is not to be taken literally. Ema. And now, what principle in terms of the various midot shatorah dreshes perhaps should we apply here in this parish of Pesach Sheni? Havile kiprat uklal. When the Torah starts with a prat, a very specific prohibition, and then it expands it to include a klal. Like, for example, here, the Torah starts saying about Pesach Sheni that al matzim rom yochluhu and lo yashir men on boker and etzem lo sit, but then it follows with a klal of kechol chukas haPesach yasu oso, implying that we expand the scope to include anything that's included in Pesach Rishon. That's called a prat and a klal, and in such cases, since the Torah opened up with prat, in this case pratim, with details, and then it says kechol chukas haPesach yasu also as a klal, v'nase klal motzif al prat afilu kol mili nami. We should therefore assume that when the Torah closes the parsha with a general rule, a klal, it's coming to add and go beyond the prat. Kamash malon. That's what the Tana in this brisa is coming to teach us, because before the klal, the prat was etzem lo yishbru bo, and if we're going to say that the klal is marba everything, then why did the Torah have to mention etzem lo yishbru bo, for example, as a prat? Why did the Torah have to spell that out if you're just giving me a klal? So the fact that the Torah added etzem lo yishbru bo in Pesach Sheni, which is totally redundant insofar as we have a klal that tells me that anything that applies Pesach Rishon, like etzem lo yishbru, should apply to Pesach Sheni, we're going to have to darshan that although the klal is a ribui that goes beyond each one of these details, but on the other hand, each one of these details of these pratim are teaching me some limitation in the scope of and the application of the dinim of Pesach Rishon to Pesach Sheni. For example, if we take the case of nosar, not leaving over from the Korban Pesach, or etzem lo yishbru bo, these are mitzvahs that apply to gufo shel carbon, and even the matzah sumrom yochlu, although it's not begufo shel korban, but it's al gufo shel korban. So we're juggling here both the klal and the pratim. The pratim have to teach me exclusions, and the klal has to teach me inclusions. And this is going to be our sugya, which we'll get to just after we analyze Isi ben Yehuda. How do we juggle between the pratim as miutim and the klal as ribut? But now the Gemara asks something on Isi ben Yehuda. Isi ben Yehuda was the one who excluded mitzvah she'eina begufon because the pasuk says kechol chukas hapesach yasu oso. He understood that oso is bedafka, not the way the Rabbanan said lav dafka. So hay etzem my ovidle. Now that you've told me from the word oso that we already know to exclude anything that's not begufon shel pesach, why did the Torah have to spell out etzem lo yishbrupo? What's he doing with the pasuk etzem lo yishbrupo? The Isser of shviras etzem is certainly begufo shel pesach and would be included by virtue of the pasuk kechol chukas hapesach, because it is included in yasu oso. It's in the oso. And the Gemara answers he needs this for another halacha. Li boile li echad etzem sheish bo moach v'echad etzem she'ein bo moach. I understand that you're not allowed to break an etzem that has no moach inside. But if the etzem has bone marrow inside, which is edible, I would think that he's allowed to break the bone in order to extract the marrow. Kamach balan, the Torah adds etzem lo yishbrubo as an extra pasuk to include even an etzem sheyesh bo moach. For Rabbanan, what do they do with hayasu oso, my avidle? After all, these words yasu oso are coming to teach you everything that you want to know, meaning that it's got to be a mitzvah begufa. They derive from this pasuk yasu oso shein shochat tines hapesach al hayochid. It says yasu in plural, and that's telling me that I need at least a minimum of two people who are bringing a manui together on Pesach Sheni. And that's l'chatchila. It's not critical, but that's what the Torah prefers. That's ideal. So it means if I was tummy during Pesach Sheni, to Pesach Rishon, I have to look around and find someone on Facebook who is also tummy on Pesach Rishon. So that together we can come and be money on Pesach Sheni. The comedy Efshaladuri Madrino. A person has to do his shtadlus. He has to try to make that effort so that he can bring Pesach Sheni berabin with a minimum of two people and run around and try to find someone else's tummy. Okay, now the Gemara is at this point where we're going to bring a brisa to go through all the details of each one of the pratim that are spelled out in the pasuk, and then we said there's a klal at the end kechol chukas hapesach, and try to see what we could derive from all the above. Tanu Rabbanan kechol chukas hapesach yasu otsa. If we start with the klal, Yochai might think kishem shepesach rishon also b'bal yirah b'imotzei. Just like in Pesach Rishon, I'm not allowed to own chametz. Any chametz in my possession, I violate a law. At the time of the shechita of korban Pesach Rishon, is kach hasheni osur b'al yirah b'imotzei. I would think also the same possession of chametz is prohibited from Pesach Sheni Tamid Lomar. The Torah says al matzos u'merorim yochluhu. And it says, lo yashiru menu ad bok v'etzem lo sishbru, bro. All these pratim were formulated and presented by the Torah before we got to the klal, the general rule of kechol chukas hapesach yasu, also equating the two. So once the Torah mentions these pratim, we cannot derive from the klal to include things that are obviously excluded from the prat. And then the Gemara is going to try to juggle and figure out, well, what should we exclude from the prat and what should we include from the klal? But one thing the Gemara says up front here in this brisa is that bal yirah b'imotzei is excluded by virtue of the prat. And since the Torah says, lo yashiru mimenu ad boker etzem lo sishbru bro, these are teaching me that only these isurim apply to korban Pesach Sheni, but the isur of bal yirah b'imotzei does not apply. The brisa continues. Ainly, I want to be marbe on top of the prat of al matzas u'rom yochlu el mitzvah aseh. So it means that, for example, I can include the mitzvah aseh of tzli, by virtue of an equation, Talmatzas Umrom Yochlu, the Torah went out of its way to teach you that a mitzvah saseh can be included in this expansion and apply to Pesach Sheni. Mitzvah lo saseh minalan. How do we know that we have a ribui from the klal that could include even a mitzvah lo saseh? Talmud loma lo yashiru mimenu ad boker. The Torah already gave me one Isur that we're not allowed to leave the Pesach, the meat of the Pesach, beyond its allotted time for Achila. Now that lav is what's called a lav hanitak li esse, because we have a mitzvah of ba'esh tisrofu in the event that it becomes nosar. So we're going to derive from the klal that we should include anything that comes under the category of a lav hanitak li esse. And we should exclude the Isur Bal Yirah B'Yimotze because we have a mute to exclude Bal Yirah B'Yimotze. So ainly, therefore, the Brisa says that once we have the ribui of the klal and the mute of the pratim, Ela mitzvahs lo saseh shenitak liyeseh. All right, we've gotten down to the level of lo yashiru mimenu ad boker. Mitzvahs lo saseh gomer minolan. Tamalom v'etzem lo sishbrubo. So we have that's in that which is spelled out in the three pratim. We have all three categories. We have a mitzvahs aseh, and that was al matzum rom yochluhu. We have a mitzvahs lav hanitak la'eseh, which was included in the case of nosar, and then finally we have a pure mitzvahs lo saseh on etzem lo yishbrubo. So we're going to have to, as we said before, exclude. And yet there's a klal. So ma haprat meforosh mitzvah sevelos shenitik lesevelos gomur, just like that which is spelled out in these three mitzvahs. We have all three categories: essay, nitak lav, nitak lese, lav gomur is af kol mitzvah sevelos shenitik lese velot nase gomur. So now we have a ribui for all these three categories. Okay, fine. We have now the Brisa, and the Brisa is going to say that on each one of these details we have a ribui, because the Torah at the end of these three pratim has the klal of kechukas haPesach. And the Gemara says, let's see what we could be marber through this klal at the end of these three pratim for each one of the three pratim. What mitzvahs aseh are you going to include with regard to Pesach Sheni based on the fact that you have a pure mitzvahs aseh and matzahs umrom that's spelled out by the Torah, and then there's a klal, as we said, to expand it? And the Gemara answers Sli H, because the Torah doesn't say explicitly that Pesach Sheni requires Sli H. So that mitzvah of Sli H as a mitzvah aseh is going to be derived from the matzahs umarorim together with the klal of kechukas haPesach. Biprate might come mightly, but on the other hand, we're saying that each one of the pratim is coming as a mitzvah to exclude. So what mitzvah say is being excluded? Hashbas asiyah. There's no mitzvah to destroy your chametz with regard to Pesach Sheni. So why not say just the opposite? Maybe the klal is coming to be marbe hashbas asiyah, and the prat is coming to exclude sli h. And the Gemara says that's not logical. Why? Because mitzvah the gufe adif. We want to be marbe something that's in the guf haPesach, and that is the mitzvah of tzli. And we're going to exclude something that's external to the guf haPesach, which is hasbasas siyar. Now we go on to the lotaseh shenitak liyaseh. Bichlale, what is included in lo yashiru mimenu ad boker? Maikomar bile lo totzi mimenu. The Torah says with regard to Pesach Rishon in Parshas Bo that you're not allowed to take it out of the house, and we're going to derive the same conclusion with regard to Pesach Sheni, deriving it from lo yashiru mimenu ad boker, which is a lav hanitak le'aseh. Now the assumption that taking the Pesach out of the house is a nitak le'aseh is something that has to be analyzed. It seems from the Gemara that if you took it out of the house, then you're required to bring it back in olav lach zero v'lechal also b'bayis, and that makes it into a lav hanitak liese. That's the simple conclusion that you derive from this Gemara. And now, beprote mai komamaitle, give me another lav hanitak liese, which applies to Pesach Rishon, but is being excluded in Pesach Sheni by virtue of the prat of lo sosiru o lo yashiru menu ad boker. And the Gemara answers lo yiroev lo yimotze. That's very similar to lo yashiru menu ad boker. Just like in lo yashiru menu ad boker, the Torah commands you to burn nosar as an essay to be menatek the lav. So too, we have a nituk of an essay with regard to lo yiroev lo yimotze, and the Torah says tashbisu that you should destroy it. Tahai Eno loka, mishum davi lavanitik lesiva. High eno loka davi lavanitik. In both cases, whether it's notzar or whether it's bal yirah by motzi, there's no malchus because it's a lavanitik liese. So on the one hand, lo yashiru mimenu ad boka as a lavanitik liese is coming to include lo totzi mimenu. On the other hand, it's coming to exclude bal yirah by motzi. Epochano. Why not switch around the other way? And again, the same logic. Mitzvah de gufe adif. That which applies to the Gufa Pesach should be given preference. And with regard to taking the Pesach out of the house, that's something that applies to the Basar of Pesach, to Gufa Shel Pesach. You might say is extraneous to the Pesach, has to do with your possession of Chometz. Now the Gemara goes on to explain the other part of the Brisa. Now we have a Lav Gomur that's not a Lav Hanitakli essay. What's it coming to be Marbe? And here we look on Daf Tzadi Hey. Omid Beis, Maika Marbe, and it's come to be Marbe al Tochlu Bimenu Na. The Torah says that you're not allowed to eat from a Pesach that was cooked. You can only allowed to eat from a Pesach that is roasted, and that lav is going to apply even on Pesach Sheni by virtue of the pasuk Etzem Lo Yishruba, which is a pure lav. Now again, the fact that the Torah gave me a prat of Etzem Lo Yishruba must be coming to exclude some other lav. Which lav is it coming to excluding? The prohibition that applies to Pesach Rishon, that you're not allowed to possess chametz at the time of the shechita, that lav has no application to Pesach Sheni. Why not say the exact opposite? Let's be marbe the is of shechita as ha-pesach al ha-chametz, and let's exclude the case of no, of eating a korban Pesach that was cooked. And once again, the Gemara's logic, mitzvah begufe adif. Because in the case of no, we're talking about the etzem basar and how to eat the basar. That has to be included in the parsha of Pesach Sheni. Masha enken, when you're talking about lo tzitchka lachametz dam zivchi, that means possession of chametz. That's external to the guf hakarban.